All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you had a refreshing lunch and you're ready for our next keynote. My name is Marwa Al-Halabi. I'm one of the co-organizers of this workshop, and I'm a research scientist at Samsung AI Lab here at Mira. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you our next keynote speaker, Jonathan Horowitz. He's the deputy head of the legal department at the International Committee of the Red Cross Delegation for the United States and Canada. Jonathan's work focuses on legal issues relating to urban warfare, partnered military operations, and new and emerging technologies in armed conflict, including information operations. Jonathan holds an LLM from the University of Essex and has authored several reports on human rights abuses in the context of armed conflict and counterterrorism. His latest publication, One Click from Conflict, explores the legal consideration related to technological companies providing digital services in armed conflicts. In this talk, titled AI in Armed Conflict, What Could Possibly Go Wrong?, Jonathan will present some of the most common military uses of AI in armed conflict today, explore what risks they pose, and describe how international humanitarian law regulates these uses, specifically with respect to cyber information operations, autonomous weapons, and like AI military decision support systems. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Horowitz.
Okay, hello and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the organizers for hosting this wonderful event and for inviting the International Committee of the Red Cross to join and give some of its perspectives on harms and risks of AI in the military. So, of course, the title of my talk is AI in Armed Conflict, What Could Possibly Go Wrong? Some of the things of which we've already heard today discussed. Let me start by telling you why the ICRC was invited to give this presentation here at this conference. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the International Committee of the Red Cross, we're a 161-year-old humanitarian organization that is neutral, independent, and impartial, that provides assistance and protects victims of armed conflict and other situations of violence. We also promote respect for international humanitarian law, or the laws of war, which is the body of law, of course, that regulates how warring parties treat each other as well as civilians. Part of the ICRC's work that we do involves assessing new weapons and technologies of warfare in terms of their humanitarian and legal implications, and if necessary, the ICRC will work for the development of laws regulating the use of weapons, things that have already been discussed throughout this day. So, for example, the ICRC has been involved in our history in the development of laws on landmines, on cluster munitions, on chemical weapons, and other arms control efforts. So, when new technologies are being created or are starting to be used on the battlefield, the ICRC uses a formulaic methodology to help us get through an understanding of its relevance to our work and our mandate. So first, we seek to determine the military designs and uses of the new technologies as they may be used in situations of armed conflict. Then we will try to evaluate what their potential harms are that could be caused for civilians, but also for combatants, which under certain circumstances also receive very important protections of international humanitarian law. And then from there, we will determine how international humanitarian law may prohibit or regulate the harms that those technologies may cause, working towards IHL compliance, but also where needed, clarification, elaboration, and potentially in some cases, the development of law. As we were discussing earlier today, the question of, are new binding rules or regulations ever required? So to do this, we often bring together outside experts for consultations, and we also have a growing amount of in-house expertise, including scientific advisors, that allow us to both publish expert reports, two of which are up on the screen for you, but there are several others, and for us to participate in multilateral intergovernmental forum, such as those that were discussed at the UN in other presentations today. So what have the experts told us, externally and our in-house experts, about some of the most prominent uses or potential uses when it comes to artificial intelligence being used by militaries in situations of armed conflict? So first, we have seen AI incorporated into autonomous weapon systems. We have seen AI incorporated and becoming a driving force behind military decision support systems, including in the use of force in situations of armed conflict. And we have seen uses of artificial intelligence in cyber operations and in information operations. So let me walk through for you each of these technologies and how at least the ICRC is seeing them, starting with autonomous weapon systems. We talked about definitions earlier today. For the ICRC, but also a number of different states, autonomous weapon systems are those that select and apply force to targets without human intervention, meaning that after initial activation or launch by a person, an autonomous weapon system will self-initiate or trigger a strike in response to information from the environment received through sensors and on the basis of a generalized targeting profile. Autonomous weapon systems, as we're seeing them being designed and potentially used, are being designed in all contexts, a point that was made earlier by Sarah, for land, air, sea, space, and cyber, and they are being developed for various purposes such as increased speed and targeting, automated area denial, for operation in communications denied areas, and in operating in large numbers or masses, operating in swarms. Examples of autonomous weapon systems are air defense systems with autonomous modes that have been used and are used aboard warships or at military bases to strike incoming missiles, rockets, or mortars. Another example are loitering weapons with autonomous modes that target based on, for example, air-to-ground radar signatures. Today, the autonomous weapon systems that we see are generally constrained in their use, whether by the types of targets that they're allowed to strike, such as only military objects, being used for limited periods of times or geographical regions, or constrained to areas where, for example, there are no civilians or civilian objects. Also being used with somewhat high levels of human supervision and the ability for there to be human deactivation. Now, of course, I do want to emphasize this point, not all autonomous weapon systems rely on artificial intelligence, but some do, and we expect more will in the future. The ICRC is also observing trends indicating a shift towards a wider range of targets, greater mobility, and an integration, as I just mentioned, about more complex AI software into autonomous weapon systems. Let's move on to the second category, which is military uses of AI in decision support systems, where you have existing or live information being processed through an algorithm that then presents itself through outputs of predicted recommendations to a human-machine interface where, for example, a commander will then use that information to either take or inform their decision. Where are these types of tools being used? Again, Sarah nicely displayed a number of them. They're being used for information processing, exploitation, and dissemination activities, looking, for example, for anomalies in behavior or physical characteristics, such as a human being who's planting an improvised explosive device. And AI DSS can also be used to map out the information environment to understand patterns of enemy behavior on social media. These decision support systems can be used for identification and classification of objects, of terrain, networks of objects like tunnel systems, also for facial recognition, for target recognition, and they can also be used for weaponeering. For example, by pairing a shooter to a target and making a prediction as to which weapon the shooter should use. Collateral damage estimates are being done through AI decision support systems, and they can also be used, as already discussed, for command and control functions by, for example, using data about military-approved targets to calculate munitions loads, prioritize and assign thousands of targets to aircraft and drones, and propose a schedule on how to proceed. Finally, from the ICRC's perspective, of course, we do not come up with an exhaustive use of AI military applications, but of the three that I mentioned, the final one is the use of AI in military cyber and information operations. Here, the use of cyber operations during armed conflict, we all know in this room, is a reality of warfare, and there's an increasing number of states that are developing military cyber capabilities, and the likely use of those capabilities are expected to rise in the future. When it comes to information operations, the ICRC has done research and observed that the spread of misleading, hateful, and other harmful information and narratives may undermine the protection and safety of people who are affected by armed conflict and other situations of violence. I'll just stay. So what are some of the operational observations that the ICRC can make about the use of artificial intelligence in autonomous weapon systems, in decision support systems, and in cyber and information operations? And it's here with these observations that we can start to uncover some of the risks associated with the use of AI in warfare. So we have loss of human control and judgment, something that's been touched on already today, a lack of understanding and the unpredictability of effects when it comes to use of force. There are data challenges, which I'll go into more detail about. There's algorithm challenges. There are challenges around human-machine interface issues. So even where you have a weapon system where the commander is the primary authorizing agent, but is relying on decisions through an AI DSS, and you may say, well, that is not an autonomous system. There are nonetheless human-machine interface issues that one needs to consider, and I'll walk through those. We've had very important discussions around speed and tempo that AI brings to warfare, and there are important and critical questions about accountability to assure that when there is human judgment and control in warfare decisions, that they remain accountable, and that somehow that accountability does not get vested into the technology that the soldier is relying on. So I mentioned data challenges. Again, to this crowd, this is probably obvious, and you can come up with a number of different hypotheticals or real-life examples where data can be injected with human bias, as we've seen with regard to things like skin color and tone. Data can be corrupted inadvertently. It can also be poisoned deliberately, or data can just be plainly incorrect. On this second topic of peacetime data, data sets drawn from collection in peacetime may not accurately reflect situations in times of armed conflict. So for example, civilian pattern of life that's collected in terms of how people behave in times of peace and stability may not map accurately at all in terms of how civilian populations behave and what their pattern of life looks like in situations of extremis where there's armed conflict all around them. There's an issue whereby when data sets are sold to governments by the private sector, governments may not be given access to the underlying data or how it was processed. And there are questions around classification errors as per the quote up on the screen. Digital representation may also be difficult. For example, if you want to use an AI decision support system to estimate civilian presence in an area based on active mobile phones. I knew that was going to happen. Thank you. Sorry about that. You can bill it to me if the ICR, Alon will cover it for the Ottawa office over here. If you're trying to trace the presence of civilians based on their mobile phone activity in a situation of armed conflict, you need to consider there may be many situations where that mobile phone activity may be disconnected for a number of different reasons. So are you appropriately and accurately actually mapping out who is in a given geographic area based on cell phone activity? Turning now to the question of human-machine interface issues that I'd already raised. There are questions around authorization bias, where human decision makers ultimately surrender their sense of legal, if not moral, obligations to the authority of a decision-making system. We have automation bias to consider, where the users favor suggestions from an automated decision support system that, and while doing so, ignores contradictory information made without automation, even if that contradictory information is correct. And reporting indicates this has become a growing problem in real-life instances in intensive care units, at nuclear power plants, and in aircraft cockpits. We have routinization issues that reduces the necessity of decision-making, thus minimizing occasions in which moral questions may arise, and it also makes it easier for the user to avoid the implications of action, since the actor focuses on details of the decision-making process rather than on the meeting of the task at hand. Digital dehumanization is an issue that the ICRC is taking into account, where people ultimately become pieces of data or digital representation, for example, through their phone numbers, and this leads to a process of dehumanizing the work to deprive the victim of their human status. On the issue of speed, which we'll get to in a moment, there are concerns around AI singularity on the battlefield, which is the point at which human cognition can no longer keep up with the pace of the speed of decision-making and the tempo of combat in future warfare. Think of the 2010 flash crash in the stock market, but instead of an algorithm causing market crashes, it would result in massive unintended death and destruction. Which brings me to this question of speed and tempo that Jessica and others have raised. Speed is often seen only as an asset on the battlefield in many military and political communities. The more information means the more targets, which means the more strikes, which means the more wins. These two quotes up on the screen, however, help provide an additional, if not a contrary, perspective. From the ICRC's understanding of warfare, it's actually slowing the tempo of decision-making, including the process and assessments that inform the decision, that allow both the system and the user to gain extra time to do a number of critically important things. Extra time allows commanders to see more, it allows them to understand more, and it allows them to develop more options. Speed may not always be your unconditional friend on the battlefield. In the first quote, we see how speed can remove human judgment and control from warfighting. And in the second quote, we see how speed can lead to errors. The redaction on the screen is not for any particular reason other than the ICRC tries to stay out of the business of being very context or technology company program specific. But these are publicly reported quotations there for you to look at if you're interested in. So what are some of the consequences that might result from introducing artificial intelligence into the battlefield, be it through autonomous weapon systems, AI decision support systems, cyber operations, or information operations? Again, we've talked about them already today, but I do think for this conference, this workshop, focused on harms and risks of AI in the military, it's helpful to repeat them, if not emphasize a few. When used in the conduct of hostilities, the consequences can be severe. We're talking, of course, unfortunately, about death, injury, damage to civilian objects and infrastructure. When that happens in urbanized environments, civilians pay a particularly heavy toll. With an artificial intelligent reliant autonomous weapon systems, attacks against an enemy might occur in a way that a commander was unable to control, with effects that the commander was unable to predict, and at a time they did not want the attack to occur. With AI decision support systems, we see the potentialities for commanders to decide to detain the wrong people, or to target the wrong people or objects. Cyber operations might result in the disruption of civilian access to essential services that are dependent on the critical digital infrastructure used by hospitals, by electrical companies, or by water treatment plant services. Also, we have to think about information operations, which can influence people to distrust humanitarian organizations that provide life-saving assistance, information operations that can stoke communal tensions, that can undermine international humanitarian law, and can escalate conflicts. Another point that was mentioned before that I want to emphasize, that artificial intelligence has the potential to multiply risks already part of today and tomorrow's armed conflicts. Take for example, a military that is very good at detecting military objectives, but it is very bad at anticipating incidental civilian harm caused by its attacks. If that same military trains an AI system to select 10 times as many targets as its intelligence analysts would without the AI decision support system, this would result in a lot more military objectives getting attacked while causing a lot more incidental civilian damage as well. So what does the law have to say about all of these risks and challenges? And as a legal advisor at the ICRC, I want to emphasize that these technologies do not exist and they must not be used in a legal vacuum. It's supposed to be the Wild West, right? So the law doesn't exist in the Wild West. These technologies don't exist in the Wild West. Okay, so let me explain a little bit more about what I mean by this, because we've thrown around the letters IHL and some principles, and I think it's worth maybe diving in with a little more detail into what they mean. In the first presentation that was given in the welcoming address, there is a mention of precautions. There is mention of dual use. These are terms that may be different in different communities. Precautions has a very specific term when it comes to international humanitarian law. So let me talk a little bit about international humanitarian law and unpack it a bit. So under IHL, the means and methods of warfare are not unlimited, and this applies to past, present, and future weapons and technologies. Here are some of the basics, again, if you're not already familiar with them. The principle of distinction up on the screen. Parties to an armed conflict under the principle of distinction must at all times distinguish between civilians and combatants and between civilians and military objects. Attacks may only be directed against combatants and military objects. Attacks must not be directed against civilians or civilian objects. Easy enough. Indiscriminate attacks under IHL are prohibited. Indiscriminate attacks are those that are not directed at a specific military objective, those that employ a means or methods of warfare which cannot be directed at a specific military objective, or employ a means or methods of warfare the effects of which cannot be limited. Under the principle of proportionality, it is prohibited to launch an attack which may be expected to cause incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, damage to civilian objects, which would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. On to the obligation to take all feasible precautionary measures to minimize civilian harm. It is essentially exactly what that says up on the screen. The reason I want to take the time to go through some of these is because when we are met with new technologies that are being either designed or used by communities, whether it's the private technology companies, whether it's members of government, could be non-state actors for that matter, there is a framework, there are a set of rules that already exist. The need to go about trying to reinvent the rule to find ways to regulate artificial intelligence in the military may not be and is not the most appropriate approach when there are already legally binding rules and principles that states and non-state armed groups that are parties to an armed conflict must comply with. But in addition to the principle of distinction, the prohibition against indiscriminate attacks, the obligation not to engage in disproportionate attacks, the obligation to take all feasible precautions, there are also other rules of international humanitarian law that exist, which I want to emphasize may be particularly important to information operations, such as the prohibition of using threats of violence to terrorize civilian populations, and the prohibition against child recruitment, and the prohibition of subjecting prisoners of war to public curiosity. And the reason why I'm emphasizing these is because all of those rules of international humanitarian law can be violated through information operations, including through the use of social media. So, what does international humanitarian law's regulation of AI mean in practical terms? I'm going to oversimplify this, but I think it's important because, again, it shows that there's a regulatory system out there that states and other parties to armed conflict must comply with. It means that an AI-enabled cyber attack against a hospital is prohibited under IHL's principle of distinction. It also means that an AI-dependent autonomous weapon system that produces insufficiently predictable effects would be prohibited under IHL's prohibition against indiscriminate attacks. It means that IHL's prohibition on the use, it means that IHL prohibits the use of autonomous weapon systems or cyber attacks that may produce disproportionate civilian harm. And as already discussed, it means that AI-enabled information operations must comply with rules of international humanitarian law. Additionally, and perhaps extremely important to our discussion around artificial intelligence, the rules of international humanitarian law are directed at and are for humans, not machines to follow. This means that the use of new technologies, not only but also including artificial intelligence, must preserve human judgment such that the rules of IHL can be and are complied with. Okay, so where does that leave us? It leaves us in a place where I'm going to be emphasizing, if not repeating, things that have already been offered as ways forward and recommendations with regard to the risks and harms that AI can present when used in armed conflict by militaries. So given the emerging uses of AI in military operations conducted during armed conflict, and given the risks that can arise for civilians, civilian objects, and others protected under IHL, it is important that those who design and those who use artificial intelligence for military applications apply IHL, understand IHL, comply with IHL, and where needed, clarify their interpretations of the rules. This is a recommendation that the ICRC usually directs at parties to armed conflict, but it's also increasingly relevant, as I've alluded to, for the private sector that's designing and building these capabilities for militaries. Beyond this, the ICRC has recommended that states adopt new legally binding rules with regard to autonomous weapon systems in ways that prohibit certain autonomous weapon systems and that restrict the design and use of other autonomous weapon systems. So this is not an outright ban or proposal for a prohibition of all autonomous weapon systems. It's a two-prong approach that prohibits those autonomous weapon systems which are insufficiently unpredictable, and for both legal, humanitarian, and ethical reasons, prohibits anti-personnel autonomous weapon systems. With regard to all other autonomous weapon systems, the ICRC is recommending to states that they put in place new binding laws that would restrict and place limits on their use. Up on the screen describes some types of those limits, as well as ensuring that there is a requirement for human supervision, deactivation, or neutralization of an autonomous weapon system once it's been deployed. And I'm going to end here in my presentation because in addition to the issue of application compliance, clarification, development, and additions of new rules, alongside the risks, are also, in the ICRC's views, opportunities, if not also obligations, to mitigate those risks and to use AI to help warring parties satisfy their obligations under international humanitarian law. So, by way of example, the ICRC recently released its own AI policy that provides guidance on how to ensure our use of artificial intelligence is properly used in line with our principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. So there's a lot of talk not only about military uses of AI, but also opportunities for humanitarian actors to use AI. But those risks do not simply evaporate because it's being used by humanitarian actors. Those risks persist, and the humanitarian community, the ICRC, has to be responsible in how we recognize and address those risks. Our legal advisors, including myself, are also encouraging those who design and use decision support systems to explore the possibilities for helping militaries, as I mentioned, better satisfy their IHL obligations, by example, using AI to better anticipate incidental civilian harm, to better understand what the US is calling in its civilian harm mitigation policy, the civilian environment, so that militaries can understand what could be anticipated in terms of incidental civilian harm or incidental damage to civilian infrastructure more broadly. As I mentioned, this work is being done through conversations with technology companies that are trying to design products for militaries. And then finally, on the far end of the screen, the ICRC continues to pursue its Digital Emblem project, which is seeking to find ways to mark digital assets of the ICRC in coordination with national societies and others, to mark those assets that are afforded the authority to use the Red Cross, Red Crescent, and Red Crystal to signal that they must be respected and protected in times of war. So that provides to you some of the ICRC's perspectives on how artificial intelligence is being used or has the potential for being used by militaries in situations of armed conflict, some of the harms and risks that we have seen or anticipate seeing, how international humanitarian law and specific rules and principles of international humanitarian law can respond to those risks, and also thinking creatively about how, whether it's the humanitarian community, the private sector, or militaries, can rely on artificial intelligence, knowing all those risks, to also satisfy their IHL obligations for the primary purpose of protecting victims of armed conflict in situations of armed conflict. So thank you for your time and patience, and welcome any questions.
Did I just go? Okay. Oh,
yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead, basically, yeah. Okay. Thank you for the talk, and thanks for keeping it. You were actually ahead of time.
Ahead of time, okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So my question's, my understanding of the Lavender system is it caused so many civilian deaths more because, commanders hard-coded in a tolerance threshold, not because AI specifically caused those, advocated killing more civilians. So my concern is, under some of the legal frameworks, if the main criteria is just the number of civilians deaths, it's possible you could design a less sloppy AI system that does kill less civilians than the average traditional military operation, and then AI becomes desirable instead of something you want to propose a ban on. So how do you think about that dilemma?
So one is I would go back and cite Jessica's remarks before, which has to do with how parties to an armed conflict, and I won't be speaking specifically about any particular armed conflict or party to an armed conflict, so I'm speaking in generalities here. When a party to an armed conflict has broad interpretations of what's permissible with regard to use of force and how it interprets IHL, those interpretations will more likely than not get baked into the AI system. Whether it's an AI system that is being incorporated into autonomous weapon systems, into cyber or information operations, or into a decision support system. And so the point being made here, right, is I think what was said already is that if you have very broad interpretations of when use of force is permissible, matched with very narrow interpretations of who constitutes, for example, a civilian or a civilian object, and you use that to shape either your decision support system or your autonomous weapon system, that's going to translate into potentially violations of IHL on the battlefield, if not, at the very least, the horrible result of extensive damage, death, and destruction to civilians and civilian objects. So I think it is really important in the way that you frame the question to think that it is really up to the commander, the user, the party to the armed conflict. It is for them to determine how to use the technologies as a means or methods of warfare, which is then thereby regulated by IHL. It is for them to determine how to use, how to scope, how to guardrail, how to restrict, limit, prohibit if needed, the technology so that when a commander uses that technology, the commander is not in violation of his or her obligations.
Okay, maybe I'll take a question online, then you can go. So you can read that. So do you foresee an evolution in responsibility attribution for harms caused through AI-based DSS, I'm not sure what that means, used in the absence of legal personhood of our AI systems?
So I think every domestic system is going to need to adapt and understand how humans are responsible for the use of AI in things that result in unlawful acts. And so it's very hard to come up with a straightforward answer to sort of say how this is going to happen. My best guess, which is probably something a legal advisor from the ICRC should never start a sentence with, but my best guess is that governments will be struggling with this, especially from a liability perspective at the domestic level. I think at the military level, there has to be a lot of work that goes on into sort of game how commanders, how users of these systems could, would, or should be held responsible under rules of international humanitarian law, under their own ROE, under their own criminal justice system. But it's absolutely critical that humans stay attached to the accountability mechanisms when they use technologies, whether it's artificial intelligence or autonomous weapon systems or whatever it is. The rules of international humanitarian law are for humans to follow and to comply with, not for machines or an algorithm to follow or comply with. There has to be a connection there, otherwise we run the risk of losing the place that humans have in warfare and their ability to regulate their own behavior.
Maybe we can take the in-person question.
Hi, Jonathan. Thank you for your presentation. I suppose my question's around the term sufficiently discriminant and sufficiently reliable. When you're talking about this in like an AI weapon system or an AI military system of any type, and you're talking about a level of performance expected of these systems that would be appropriate for them to then be fielded, I suppose my question is, how sufficiently predictable does that have to be from the ICRC perspective? And if we're going off, say, for instance, as good as a human, there's pretty wide tolerances in terms of the performance of different militaries in terms of how discriminate they can be and how reliable they can be in their strikes.
Yeah. So it's a really important question because it comes up very frequently. The way that I tend to think about it, unfortunately, is to say, give me the exact situation that you're thinking of, right? Because it's going to matter. If you're going to say that you are a commander who's looking to reduce civilian harm while targeting an adversary's target in a densely populated urban battlefield, an AI decision support system, if not an autonomous weapon system, would predictably be very fragile for getting the civilian harm reduction component of that priority sufficiently matched. Now, at the same time, for humans, for a soldier, it may also be difficult for that individual to fully evaluate sort of how to mitigate civilian harm. All that being said, I think this goes back to this question of, should we be taking it on face value that an AI system will always be more accurate than a human? So I think that's sort of one way to respond. What we do know is that autonomous weapon systems, whether they rely on AI or not, have been used in certain circumstances, and I had mentioned some of those limitations, in places where, for example, there is either no or very, very, very limited civilian presence, right? So the notion that there could be an IHL violation, if not mistakes with regard to civilian harm, are relatively low. But when people say, oh, in the maritime environment, those systems are fine, when we start hearing about new and emerging prospects for warfare in maritime environment, we also start hearing about civilian vessels and fishing ships and things like that. And so all of a sudden, the maritime environment isn't as predictable as it might have been. So it always usually comes down to a case study to be able to answer that question, because some will be easier to answer than others.
Thank you. I'll take one online question and you can go. So here's a question I think is similar to what came up earlier in the panel. I think, what can we contribute to the effective implementation of international humanitarian law, future ones on AWS or current ones, if we see daily how they are being violated in impunity?
So this is a very important question to new and emerging technologies, but it is not unique to new and emerging technologies. There is warfare going on across the globe, unfortunately, where there are problems and concerns around IHL compliance with the most rudimentary types of technologies being used in warfare, right? So this is not, the technology does not bring a unique compliance problem to the battlefield in so much as there's already a compliance issue going on with regard to warfare. It's something that the ICRC's president has spoken passionately about in terms of IHL compliance. It's something that the ICRC works at the domestic level across the globe, trying to help states bring into their domestic legislation different rules or mechanisms that can help with greater compliance. And of course, there are other international regimes that are out there that strive towards it. The issue of IHL compliance is an extremely, or should I say, the issue of IHL non-compliance is an extremely important one that's extremely difficult, and I'm not going to try to sugarcoat it by saying it's not an issue. It's an issue that has always been with us in warfare. It's one of the reasons why IHL exists. It's one of the reasons why a grave breaches regime within the Geneva Conventions, grave breaches are rules around war crimes. It's why war crimes exist. So the history of IHL speaks to a history of non-compliance of IHL. At the same time, the ICRC has mapped out different examples where parties to an armed conflict, whether professionalized states or non-state armed groups, do comply with international humanitarian law. And we've conducted research into behavioral science research and studies that tries to understand why a warfighter may be more inclined to respect IHL as opposed to violate IHL. So I hope that answers the question. It's a difficult one, but it's one that hopefully we all collectively can work on together.
Thank you. I can go ahead, Karim.
Thanks. So I had a question, actually the same question. The gentleman before me came up here, so it's going to allow me to give you the follow-up to that question, which is, again, the threshold seems to be identifying sufficiently unpredictable or insufficiently predictable. That seems to be a key component to deciding what is allowed and what is not allowed in terms of AWS, from what I understand, in the whole framework. And as you rightly pointed out, that's really difficult to do, and it's going to have to be done on a case-by-case basis. So this takes me to the question of, okay, so what do we do? Because this is going to be really difficult to do on a case-by-case basis. We're talking about a theoretical framework of providing some general rules, but if translating them into actionable things will depend on us having a real case scenario each time, which we will never have. We will never have the data. Does this mean, and I know it's a bit provocative, but does this mean this is just going to remain a theoretical construct and won't actually translate into saving more lives?
So I don't think it will remain a theoretical construct, and the reason I say that is because many rules of international humanitarian law fall into the same category. The principle of proportionality. Different states interpret that differently. There is no mathematical equation. The obligation to take all feasible precautionary measures to minimize civilian harm. What does all feasible mean? These different components of international humanitarian law that try to both demand protection for civilians and others while also understanding the practical realities and complications of fighting wars will often allow for certain levels of interpretation. At the moment, the ICRC is very concerned with how some states are using that to their advantage to use more force and violence in armed conflict than to do what IHL's goal and object and purpose is, which is to place limits on means and methods of warfare. At the same time, as I say that, I also know that states and non-state armed groups that are parties to armed conflict do things such as take all precautionary measures to minimize civilian harm, or take precautionary measures to minimize civilian harm. So one of the questions will be, ultimately, how do states, if they decide to go forward with new rules, how do they interpret things like insufficiently predictable? And I think that is something that feels maybe very new to communities that are unfamiliar with international humanitarian law. As a legal advisor, that's something that's very familiar to me. That's how parts of the law operate. And we also see, in addition to our concerns that were just talked about in terms of lack of IHL compliance, we also see states, militaries, others implement regulations, rules, protocols that do limit what they're allowed to do on the battlefield.
But isn't that related to accountability being an important factor in this? Because some states try to evade accountability as much as they can and benefit from impunity. Others, and these might be some of the examples you're mentioning, where actually might not even be in warfare, but are actually implementing these things and being like the good students of the classroom trying to do this. But in cases where international law has been baffled and the main objective is actually just trying to get whatever military gains that they want, they will always find ways of playing around with the rules and so on. This is why I'm concerned.
Yes, I think that is part of the environment of armed conflict. It's not something that will be unique to the term insufficiently predictable, for example. The issue, again, around accountability is something that we have been sort of struggling with collectively more than, myself. People who have been living through armed conflict, struggling through their ability to hold perpetrators of IHL violations accountable. So that would be an added component, without a doubt, to bringing new technologies onto the battlefield.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, we're running a bit behind schedule, so maybe you can discuss with the speaker after. But I'll invite you all to thank Jonathan again. Thanks for the great talk.
Thank you very much.